let's go there.
Okay. So, how did you end up at the University of Tennessee?
Well, I originally was working with the Forest Service on a postdoc, and I was interested. I'm supposed to look at you or the camera, right? So,
You can look at me.
This general direction.
well, originally I worked with the Forest Service on a postdoc, and was interested in doing research and looking. I was on like a term position for 4 years, and wanted to find something more permanent, another opportunity. And so I started looking at academic positions at different universities and so on. And the position here at Knoxville had come open, and turned out it was involving about half teaching and half research. So I thought, well, I'm interested in doing the research, and hopefully I can handle the teaching and so on. And since I've come here, I've been really interested in teaching and had a good time doing it. So it's been a nice mixture of both for me. So came here 20 years ago, actually, in 1998 in the fall. So,
Why did you choose to focus on forest science?
yeah. When I was growing up, I used to go to nature centers quite a bit, actually, and hike in the woods and that kind of thing with my father and my brother. And I had all the nature books, the golden guides on birds and so on, and on mammals and that kind of thing, animal tracks, all that kind of stuff was interesting to me. So I wanted to get into biology. I knew that much, and I got into biology, and then I kind of made a decision, plants or animals, and kind of was more interested a little bit in botany and growing things and so on. Then within botany, I got interested in trees just because they're so large and they have such a big impact on kind of creating the habitat, or all kinds of habitats really that are in the forest. So I was interested in working with sort of trees and how they would grow and how they would develop into canopies and that kind of thing. So that's kind of just a sequential, I guess, series of decisions along the way. So. Okay, if I look at you then?
Yeah, that's
okay.
perfectly
It's a lot
fine.
better than a piece of plastic. Yeah, since we're talking too, it seems natural.
Person.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So how does forestry, wildlife, and fisheries affect an everyday Knoxville civilian?
Yeah, well, for our resources, forestry, wildlife, and fisheries, all of them really do affect all people on Earth, basically, from a kind of an ecosystem support system, kind of giving us clean water, that type of thing, food and that sort of stuff worldwide, and also recreation opportunities, well-being, happiness, chances to get out and enjoy the outdoors and that sort of stuff. So there's really a lot of different amenities that are produced. Also things like paper and lumber and materials that we use to build things and so on. And some of the wildlife and fisheries provide a lot of recreation opportunities and chances to get out and do that too, and just do wildlife watching as well. And, all kinds of things that people enjoy doing. So I'd say, not everyone necessarily goes out and hikes in the forest, but in one way or another, everybody's touched by our environment and, the ecosystems that make up our environment worldwide, really. So it's all part of the same, network of factors and so on that influence human industry and human health and human well-being and so on. So it's all kind of interrelated. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's a great answer.
Can you elaborate on why invasive species pose such a threat to the Knoxville community?
Mm-hmm. The thing about invasives are they're not well adapted to other species that have never been in contact long enough to kind of co-adapt or co-evolve with native species, and so there's a couple of ramifications to that. And one is that when you do have an invasive plant that comes in, it may have no natural predators or no natural herbivores that would eat it, so they can grow unchecked and uncontrolled, so they can overpopulate an area really quickly. And then the other side of the coin is that the native species aren't really well adapted to utilizing those plants if they're invasive plants, and they may not be as nutritious and so on. And so from a native ecosystem standpoint, it can cause changes in the system, and things even like that would affect people. It can be things like a change in the fire regime. If it's a grass or something that's much more flammable than the natural vegetation, and it would catch fire and that kind of thing easily around homes and so on, it's actually an actual direct risk factor to people. Also, there's a lot of cost involved with invasives and the things they do. Thinking about animals like zebra mussels and so on, they coat all the water intake areas and so on to get fresh water for drinking water supplies and so on, so it costs a lot of money to clean those off. You can think of some wetland plants that would choke waterways and that kind of thing and change drainage patterns, and so they can get to be very expensive as well as damaging to our systems. It is interesting with plants though, because some of them can have positive effects, some have negative effects clearly, and some have sort of neutral effects. And if you were to drive down the highway like Alcoa Highway, most of the vegetation you see is non-native grasses and so on. So some are somewhat benign, some are used as forage for cattle and that kind of thing, but there are definitely ones that have negative impacts because they would take over an understory, like garlic mustard or microstegium. That grass takes over everything, and sort of some of the cost of that is in the future. Then they're kind of hindering natural tree regeneration. The tree seedlings are not surviving as they should, and so they're actually changing the future forest composition, and maybe we're losing some of the value of our species like oak, for instance. Oaks are very valuable for wildlife and producing acorns and that type of thing, and valuable to us for lumber and aesthetic reasons and so on. So they can push out more desirable species, and they also change the native ecosystem. And actually, not in Knoxville per se, but say the Park Service, their mission is to preserve sort of natural heritage and preserve and make sure we have sustained native ecosystems. So invasives pose a big threat to that, and any other piece of land that they come in on, is kind of the mission is to try to retain native ecosystems and keep them healthy. So they function the way they should as well. Things like water storage, water supply for people are also affected by the types of forests you have. As I mentioned, trees affect so many different things: how much evaporation there is, soil temperature, soil water, how fast flooding occurs, all kinds of things. Does that cover that?
That was great.
Yeah. Covered a lot of the
Maybe
questions.
too much.
No, it's fine. Is that basically what you talked about when you were published in Northern Journal?
Well, the goal of that project we were interested in doing was actually, the background on the project was to improve habitat for wild turkey. So we were doing treatments that thinned out the canopy a little bit so that we get more light on the forest floor. And we talk about a shelterwood treatment that's more of a timber harvest method, and also it's also called a reproduction method, but you take a certain number of trees out and kind of thin out the canopy, and that brings more sunlight onto the forest floor, and then that encourages understory plants to grow, so it improves some of the structure on the forest floor just a few feet above the ground for species like turkey and so on that need different types of structure. One thing they benefit from are insects that live in the grass and so on, so you bring in some native grasses when you bring in more sunlight. Then another treatment was a wildlife thinning, where we just did something that a landowner could do, is kind of girdle trees so that they would die slowly, and they kind of give some cover as dead trees as well as live ones, but it thins out the canopy the same way. So both of those treatments added sunlight in kind of a patchwork fashion, and when you do that, it increases the number of microhabitats for the plants that grow in the understory. And so when you have more habitat types, then you get more plant diversity. And some of that diversity can be weedy things that are like grasses, for instance, that are more adapted to open sunlight. And then in the shadier patches, we still have the more shade-tolerant species that would be there too. So it kind of mimics what happens with old-growth forest. When you have old forests, we have large gaps forming, like 2 or 3 trees at a time fall down. You have really wide, big open areas as well as closed areas. So the more variability you get in those like lighting conditions, then the more habitat variability you have, and then the more species diversity you have. But I should say too that when we did it with the management treatment, you have to keep redoing that because the forest tends to keep growing, right? And so those gaps close up and so on. And so every forest is at a certain stage in its life cycle. It starts out really thick with little seedlings, and it's really thick with saplings, and then it stays fairly closed and very shady and sort of uniform throughout the understory. But then when it gets a little bit older yet, then you start to get a few natural gaps that form. So what we did was put some extra gaps in, kind of in a short period of time, which kind of moves that along towards maybe the old growth stage where you've got larger gaps happening. So, but this will recover. As I say, old growth kind of goes on kind of perpetually just by nature of being kind of a natural system with large old trees. And you get a lot more diversity in structures and things. One thing that's different from what we did in old growth is that you get an expression of some of the characteristics in trees like shaggy bark and so on, that bats can roost underneath those, kind of like you think of a shagbark hickory. Some of our white oak and so on, as they get older, they get shaggier bark and that kind of thing. And also horizontal branch placement, kind of more of a 90-degree angle. These big old limbs kind of go out from the trunk and they make nice nesting platforms and that kind of thing. So, and you could develop hollows. The older a tree gets, a hollow tree is a good den tree and that kind of thing too. So there's a lot of kind of characteristics that trees don't really express until they get to be 300 or 400 years old. So there's some added structure that you get with old growth that we couldn't get in our study because we were working in a much younger forest too. But we were trying to help the situation along by creating some of the gaps that are there. And what's interesting with that is you can make any pattern you want, and so there's room for more exploration into what size gaps and what distribution and so on we want to create. So, does that answer that question?
It does, yeah.
Cool. That's what we were up to. So. Yeah, it turned out we also use prescribed fire, which is a natural factor that's been kind of suppressed over the last several decades and so on. When we had kind of turn of the century logging, we lost most of our forest, was clear cut and so on, and there wasn't any thought about what's going to come up next, what kind of species would come in and regenerate. And with that logging, there was lots of dead wood or slash on the ground, and so you had lots and lots of fires. And when the forest started to grow, people said, well, I'm not going to let it burn again, so they essentially prevented fire for decades and decades. And so now in this study, we put prescribed fire back in to also help kind of convert, make some extra habitat heterogeneity that is good for things like grasses and so on. Like you can have an understory full of tree saplings, and sometimes if you allow prescribed fire into it, it turns those over, it kills them, but then it opens up habitat for more herbaceous forbs and that kind of thing, and grasses that some wildlife prefer, like turkey and so on. So that was another piece of the study that I forgot about, but that was something that we added on top. So. And they're doing more of that in National Forest, National Park Service. You've seen like in Cades Cove and so on, they're burning, and it's got some good benefits to it. So.
Okay. Have you ever worked with an environmental nonprofit like Himes?
Yeah, well,